All right, here we go. 8.6 newly independent states. So a lot of these are going to be based around decolonization. So make sure if you haven't done so already to go over into watching topic 8.5 first. Some of those will kind of hinge on your understanding of those into what we're talking about here. So our central questions for today is what political changes led to the territorial, demographic, and economic impacts? And then to what extent did economic reforms in newly independent states succeed? So, context wise, we're talking between 1945 and 2000. And the number of countries had doubled, mostly due to decolonization. We talked about that in the last one. A lot of it revolved around after World War II. A lot of these states, the colonial powers of Britain and France, could no longer hold on to their colonies. Some of them, these colonies negotiated, some of these went through violent means. And so that is what we're going on from the previous topic area that we talked about. So, creation of new states is going to impact people's lives. It's just going to. And it isn't always easy, and sometimes it can be messy. And trying to find a way to modernize, try to catch up with the rest of the world, it does have some impacts and will lead to governments taking more control. So, let's talk about the newly independent states. So, redrawing political boundaries after the withdrawal of colonial authorities led to the creation of new states. And so, some of the examples we're going to talk about, we'll talk about India again. We'll also talk about Palestine, which we've talked about previously, which was a mandate after World War One, and Palestine becoming the new state, a new state of Israel. And then, of course, there's going to be some of the other new countries that I will not talk about in too much detail about, but Syria, Transjordan, which is now Jordan, Iraq. These are new states that will be created. So the examples I'm going to talk about today are not necessarily the only ones, but they do represent states that were once colonies that become new independent states themselves. So let's talk about Israel. So going back to previous lectures, I talked about the Zionist movement, especially in between the world wars. The Balfour Declaration, the British Declaration, basically sets aside inside what was the Palestine Mandate, is going to be created for a place, an opportunity for Jews from Europe to leave and move to Palestine to create their own country, their own sense of nationalism. And doesn't come without consequences itself, because again, you're going to have an influx of people who weren't there living there originally, displaced people who were living there. But for many people who were part of the Zionist movement, they viewed Israel and Jerusalem to be their ancestral homeland. So this is going to lead to a migration that will accelerate after World War II. And of course, we remember from our previous lessons in World War II, you had the Holocaust. Millions of Jews, 6 to 7 million Jews were killed. And so many of them did not want to return back to their homes in Germany and parts of Europe, because anti-Semitism is not something that just came and went. It's something that came and is still there today. If you watch the news of what's going on in Europe, a lot of right-wing organizations are starting to come up again, and they definitely still hold this anti-Semitic viewpoints. So, for those reasons, a lot of people who were not necessarily Zionists in their beliefs, they still believed that they needed to escape Europe. And so the acceleration of migrations after World War II to Palestine ends up leading to the creation of a new state. And the United Nations mandates that the State of Israel is created in 1948. And the State of Israel, when it is created, it leads to more Jews who are going to move there. And it's going to displace more ethnic Arabs, Palestinians, who, again, going back to after World War I, many of them were promised a state of their own by the British government. Lawrence of Arabia recruited lots of Arabs to fight and rise up and get rid of the rule of the Ottomans, because they thought they would get their own state. And here it is being given to somebody else. So this is going to create problems. Still creates issues to this day. There's going to be several wars that break out between Israel and the Arab states. The examples I've kind of talked about here: the Suez Canal crisis, which I talked about in our previous lecture. The is U.S. or sorry, the French and the British asked the Israel to invade Egypt so that they could help regain and recapture Suez Canal from the Egyptians who had nationalized it under Nasser. So that's something, an example of a war. The 6 Day War that happened between Egypt, Israel, Syria. That war, it only lasts 6 days, and a lot of it's because of the support that Israel gets from allies, the most powerful, which being the United States, who is their biggest ally in the world yet to today. And the state of Israel probably doesn't exist without the support of the United States. So, we'll talk about this later on in Unit 9, but, Arab and Islamic terrorism, I shouldn't say Arab, more Islamic radicals look at the United States as being a threat because, the support of Israel is one of the big issues that plagues the Palestinian people and why they're displaced and so forth. So peace has been attempted. Oh yeah, and the Yom Kippur War, another example of a war between Israel and surrounding Arab states. But peace has been attempted. There was some accords that were negotiated during the time when Jimmy Carter was the president. He helped mediate that. But there's always been this sticking issue over Jerusalem and who gets access to Jerusalem. There's the issue that when Israel became a state, it ends up displacing many as 4 million people from their homes that had to move to places like Jordan and Syria. There's a lot of unresolved issues that simply cannot be just fixed because of how much things have changed there over time. There's no easy solution to that. And for many of the Palestinians, they view that place as their ancestral home. Israeli people and Jewish people view it as their ancestral home. And it's really difficult to put it into perspective. I guess the easiest thing, I've heard this analogy before about, we live in Utah. Utah was once part of Spanish and Mexican territory. The United States took control of it after the War of 1848 and the Mexican-American War. And it would be like if Mexico just all of a sudden got this back and then people who are already living here would have to leave. It's just not going to happen. And there's no really easy solution. The idea of a two-state solution could work, but Israel is under the government of a very right-wing government that is very Israeli nationalist and believe that land, they should expand that control over that land and so forth. So to kind of put it more in perspective of how things have changed from the creation of Israel to today, this map really shows a lot of it. And so, when the state of Israel was created, the lands that originally were controlled by the Palestinians are all in green, and the white was where you had these Jewish settlements. And then in 1947, when they created the state of Israel, this was the partition plan. It was trying to model after the plan that was in place in India, by partitioning India into Pakistan and India, and then later Bangladesh. That had consequences too, with people having to be forced to move to one state or the other, and as many as 1 million people could have died in this forced migrations and through internal displacement. So here's the partition plan. The green was Palestinian land, the white was supposed to be Israeli land, but over time you can see the Israelis, as more and more Jewish people migrate to Israel and become part of the Zionist movement, they are going to try to take more and more land. And so here we are at 2000, and today, there's a wall that kind of surrounds parts of these settlements, separating Jewish people from Palestinian people. Some people even refer to it as an apartheid today in Israel. And so, the things that go on is going to continue to go on until one or both sides agree that there needs to be potentially a two-state solution, and create two separate states with defined borders and where settlements can happen. And I don't know if that's going to happen because Israel is adamantly against that today. Palestine, still many Palestinians want to be able to return to their homes, and yeah, it's tough. It's a peace in the Middle East eludes us for these complex reasons. There's no simple solution to it. Okay, so let's switch over to a different part of the world, and it's Cambodia. And after World War II, Cambodia pressured France to gain independence. And just like with Vietnam, some of it's going to be through violent means, and some of it's going to be through negotiation. So once they were given freedom and such, during the time of the Vietnam War with the United States involved, Cambodia ends up becoming a part of the war because its location next to Vietnam. There was a trail, it was known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, in which the North Vietnamese would use it to put supplies and soldiers into South Vietnam, because there was this demilitarized zone that was well guarded. So to get around that, they went through Cambodia. We knew about this when Nixon comes into office. He orders the bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And this was all done in secret. So Cambodia ends up becoming part of the war itself. Many Cambodians die and so forth because of that. But after the Vietnam War had ended, a communist guerrilla force, a communist leader, a guy named Pol Pot, he leads an organization of communists who are known as the Khmer Rouge, the Cambodian Reds. So they're communist Reds. You make the connection there. But the Khmer Rouge wanted to do a cultural revolution in the idea of the Chinese model. And for their movement, they were vehemently anti-Western. And so they wanted to get rid of all of the ideas of Westernism out of their country altogether. And for Pol Pot, he believed the idea of a perfect society is one in which people live in communes, and they are going to be able to do subsistence farming and take care of their basic necessities and lives that way. So he wanted to erase anything that kind of doesn't go along with that idealism. And so there becomes a genocide that occurs in Cambodia, which you guys learned about a little bit with the mass atrocities section in Unit 7. But ultimately, a quarter of their population will die through famine and targeted violence against certain groups. And it wasn't really clear. It wasn't like an ethnic group. It was certain people. So if you were like an intellectual, a teacher, if you had a job that required some amounts of education, even if you appear to be intellectual, if you had glasses, you became a target of this genocide. And 250,000 of people died under Pol Pot's rule. And in 1977, Vietnam looked at how bad Cambodia and destabilization of what's going on in Cambodia and the mass genocide, and they invade Cambodia. They remove Pol Pot from power, and they essentially, not necessarily take control, but they become a stabilizing force within that country, and until 1989 when they withdraw. In 1991, they hold free elections, and they do democratically elect a government, and they begin to bring in more free markets into Cambodia. But the newly independent states, this is one of the more extreme examples of how it goes wrong, and again, it goes back to colonialization. Pol Pot wanted to reject everything that was colonialization and westernization. And he does so in the most extreme way you could think of. And that leads to this genocide that goes on. So an issue of newly independent states, this is one of the worst ones. The next one is Pakistan, and I don't want to talk too much about this one because I imagine some of you are starting to fast forward. You say, "Oh, Pakistan, we've talked about this." But in a brief, India, 1947, it evinces its independence. It creates two new countries, Pakistan and India. Pakistan was split in kind of two sections, as you can see here, where there was predominantly Muslims prior to the partition. This eventually becomes Bangladesh a little later on. The transition, though, is chaotic. Roughly 10 million people were forced to migrate from one side to the other, making sure that the Muslims were on one side of the boundary and the Hindus were on the other. And in doing so, there's violence that occurs between Muslims and Hindus, and even Sikhs to some lesser degree as well. And roughly 500,000 to 1 million people end up dying in that transition. The one thing that still continues to be an issue today is the region of Kashmir, which is this beige color up here in the corner of Pakistan. And it was never clear when they partitioned who really owned that land. It was given to India, but it also, let's just say this. Part of it was given to India. Part of it was given to Pakistan. But the region itself is still predominantly Muslim. And so Pakistanis still view this as it's theirs. And of course, India, when they redrew the lines, it's theirs. And they don't want to give it up because it's a very rich, economically viable region for each country. And the fear for Pakistan is that Hindus are the minority, but they rule over it and they will discriminate against Muslims. And then, of course, India wants to keep that land because that's, to them, was where the boundary was drawn. So it's a very concerning conflict, and it does lead to sometimes shots being fired on both sides. It's even more concerning because during the early 2000s, both countries are going to be able to acquire nuclear weapons. India builds their own nuclear weapon program, and then with the help of China, Pakistan creates their own nuclear weapons. So a hot war that breaks out between these two countries could have potentially international effects. And if they do decide to use their nuclear weapons, which is very scary to think of, that could have environmental impacts that affect us all. So, newly independent states, states after World War II, governments often took a very strong role in guiding economic life to promote development. And, when the colonial powers leave, they did leave some stuff. In India, in Africa, you had a lot of railroads and such, but there's still a lot of development needing to be done. And this is going to lead some economic, when they become independent, there's going to be more countries that are going to take a stronger role government-wise into their economy. So let's talk about some examples from the curriculum. Let's talk about Nasir. Nasir, he is going to be the guy who takes the presidency after Egypt, wins its independence from the Ottomans, and then, of course, less colonial control. Excuse me. After the nationalization of the Suez Canal, which leads to then becoming Suez Canal being in international waters. So one thing that he promotes is the idea of Nasserism, and it's a combination of Marxism and Islamic and Arabic principles. He doesn't fully accept Marxism or communism to like the degree we'll see in the Soviet Union and China, and a lot of that's because Marxism rejects religion in a lot of ways, and he certainly doesn't want to. He wants to keep a lot of the Islamic principles that have been part of the cultural traditions of North Africa and Egypt for many, 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 many decades and centuries. So the idea of Nasserism, it still holds on to, like, there's going to be more government involvement, and in his case, he puts a lot of money and investment into the infrastructure projects of Egypt, particularly damming up parts of the Nile River for agricultural and industrial purposes. Use a hydroelectric dam to create more power, to help industrialize more. The damming up of parts of the Nile River and other rivers leads them to be able to provide more water so that they can expand their agricultural programs and so forth. And so he pushed for this modernization and doing this and used 5 year plans. And we talked about 5 year plans before with China, with, of course, the Soviets. And they had various degrees of effect, but there's also severe consequences. Well, not as terribly bad in Egypt. These 5 year plans do help push them towards modernization. But again, it's not an enforced authoritarian way. There's still this idea of privatization still occurs in Egypt. So he finds, I wouldn't say the happy medium, but not something that's going to be a total command economy, but a good example of a country that becomes more involved, governments become more involved in shaping the economic outcome of their country. He does reject imperialism and Western influence, but he also does take money from the World Bank. He does use money from the Soviets, who help him build some of his dam projects, and some money from the United States as well. So even though he was very much part of the non-aligned movement, he does get support and kind of, I don't want to say plays both sides, but he does use both sides to his advantage. All right, so then we're moving on to India. Indira Gandhi, who was the daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru, and she married a man named Gandhi, but she has no relationship to Mahatma Gandhi himself. Okay, she's the prime minister who will follow after Nehru, and she is going to originally try to use the economic principles of a free market economy, similar to what the United States does in its early years. Not as much today, but anyway, the issues after 1967, she becomes more increasingly socialist, and a lot of it's because her country is definitely populated to the max. There's only so much economic development that can occur that can keep up with the rising population. And so, because of issues economically, unemployment, so forth, she's dealing with a lot of pushback. There are riots that are occurring in our country, and she declares a state of emergency. And for a lot of people who study Indian history, this kind of time period is known as the emergency. And in doing so, she is going to take a more hands-on approach by the government to deal with some of the economic issues of her country. And she proposes this idea of a 20-point program. And this is something that will continue today. Modi, the prime minister of India today, has his own 20-point program, but it's not like the 5 year plan, but it's like every once in a while they put out this new 20-point program to help make the economy go working better and such. At least that's the attempt. She does have some various degrees of success. They did get some more control over their inflation, so the value of the money didn't continue to drop. They were able to come up with some anti-corruption reforms that does not end corruption, but significantly lessens it. And they do increase the national production of their country industrially, which all were examples of how her 20-point program did succeed. But regardless of that various degree of success, there were a lot of controversial things that came with the 20-point program. And in my research, one of the things that was part of it, I guess, was that they wanted to force sterilization of people so that they would have less kids. Now, I'm not going to go into details about what forced sterilization looks like, but I can imagine not everyone is going to be lining up to be part of that. And so that's something that made her more unpopular. And she was not reelected in the 1977, I think, or 74, 6 elections. I can't remember what their terms are, but she was not reelected, and but still stayed very much in Indian politics. And in fact, the fact she got elected in 1980 again was a example of like some of her policies working to some extent. And so, yeah, she was reelected in 1980. But again, some of her policies were not very popular, and she ends up getting assassinated in 1984. But India still today does these 20-point programs, and it's an example of how their government is taking more of an active role in shaping the outcome of their economic output and other things. Another example of the countries that are getting more involved, the governments are getting more involved in the economy, is Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. And he becomes the leader of Tanzania after they emerged from colonialism. And he was the leader until 1985. Now, if you guys are looking at his picture and you're wondering, why did he choose that facial hair? I don't know. But he was not a fascist. He did advocate for more socialist programs, more government involvement. He does nationalize the banks. He does nationalize many of the major industries of his country. And he had very close ties to communist China. And so he wasn't communist himself, but he certainly practiced a level of socialism and government involvement that did try to nationalize many, many, many parts of his economy. Not all of it, but lots of it. He definitely promoted the idea of cooperative cooperative farming programs, and where they are forcing collectivization onto the people. Not similar, but if you guys remember when we talked about Stalin and he did that back in his early 5-year plan, it's to that model itself. And it did not ultimately lead to a great deal of success. Tanzania experiences a lot of hardships, some of them environmental, some of them mismanagement by the government itself. He was not able to, despite the fact that he had plans in place to bring his country out of poverty, it doesn't work. And by the time he ends up leaving office in 1985, his country was considered the poorest and lowest developed country in the world. So even though he's taken a more hands-on approach, it didn't necessarily lead to success. And that's really, when people talk about socialism fails. He's an example of sometimes it doesn't work. There are other examples of sometimes it does. And it's not like one thing will work for everyone. It doesn't. Capitalism doesn't work for everyone. Socialism doesn't work for everyone. And there's a lot of other factors that play other than just how economic models work. There's many factors at play there. So, okay. Srimavo Bandaranaki. I literally practiced this before this video, and it left my mind. So, but another example of a country, Sri Lanka, that island that's off the coast of South Asia, off the coast of India. She is going to be the head of the government and prime minister up until when she's assassinated. But another example that College Board has put in the illustrative examples of a government taking more control, a newly independent state taking more control by the government in the economy. And so she did things like nationalize the banks and many other industries, and she promoted a form of socialism in Sri Lanka too. And so she's fairly new. I'm not an expert on her by any means, but another example of more hands-on approach by newly independent states within their economies to try to bring them out of poverty and to help kind of modernize their countries, so to say. All right. So that leads us to the last part of newly independent states is the migration of former colonial subjects to imperial metropolis. These are basically the major cities of the former colonizing countries. Okay. They maintained cultural and economic ties between their colony. And then even after the dissolution of the empires themselves, as they dissolved, they still maintained strong ties to their former colonial countries, colonial controlling countries. Okay. So here's some examples. Many South Asians moved to Britain. People from Pakistan, from India, A lot of them end up moving to Britain and living in the cities such as London. If anyone's ever been to London, it is a very ethnically and culturally diverse place. Even today, like the national dish of India. I mean, most of you, if I were to ask you, and you're welcome to put in the comments what you think it would be, the national dish of India, I would imagine many of you would have thought that it is fish and chips. And as much as I like fish and chips, there's a dish I like even more, just like most Brits, and that is curry. And curry is something that gets introduced by South Asians into London, and that's really it's the national dish of India or of England today, which mostly kind of comes from South Asia. But yeah, lots. And it's not just South Asians who are moving to India. I mean, a lot of people from Chinese areas that China controlled moved to Britain and London. Again, it's a very ethnically diverse city, and that's a lot of because many people moved even after colonization to England and to major cities such as London. Algerians, a lot of Algerians moved to France to escape some of the violence from the civil war that was occurring there after they had won their independence. And again, many Algerians were very pro-French. Many French saw Algeria as like part of their homeland, as part of their country, but a lot of them ended up moving there as well. Filipinos, Philippines were under the control of the United States from 1898 to 1945. Many of the modernization of the Philippines were with the help of the United States. The relationship between the United States and the Filipino people today is still very connected. So there's a lot of connections there from the Philippines to the United States, and so many Filipino people have moved from the Philippines to the United States and made the United States their homeland, and they moved to the major cities of Los Angeles, New York. But you will even find a lot of people who are Filipino in the United States as well, in Salt Lake as well. So they moved to a lot of the major cities in the United States. So another example of that. Okay, so that's it for this part of the unit. And so go to Canvas. Make sure you answer what political changes led to the territorial, demographic, and economical had impacts, and then to what extent did economic reforms in newly independent states succeed. So those are the things that you'll need to answer. Make sure you guys are adding examples. If you're just simply saying there were large changes, it's not going to work. You need to such as, okay? So make sure you're adding your examples. Always add examples, even if it's not asking you in the question directly. Always add examples that support your answer, okay? All right, that's it for me. And again, I hope the video here today finds everyone healthy and safe back at home. And if you guys have questions, make sure you reach out to me, and I will see you for our next lecture soon.